Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're at almost capacity, but we will await more participants and attendees at this town hall that we have for you today. And just wanted to let you know that we do have the attendees' microphones muted at this time. So please be aware of that, but the chat box is open. And if something happens, or if I have any kinds of these information wrong, I will be corrected by Mila Fuller and Adam Resch, who are helping me with the coordination of this and the logistics. So this is being recorded. Thank you for joining us. And before we get started, I wanted to send a great welcome, obviously, for attending this important town hall, for us to get together as a College of Education community. There have been so many types of concerns that we've been hearing of. And so it's a special thank you to the students who have mentioned the need not only for a gathering like this, but also for us to acknowledge the particular stresses that you're going through at this time, right? We are still under COVID, that's obvious. But within that, there are those added stressors that are affecting populations disproportionately, right? So that is an additional stressor for a number of you. I was just telling my family the other day that this is not a coincidence that in the last 3 months, I have heard from faculty or students who have lost their loved ones during this time, and they're all African American. So this is also speaks to a larger domestic as well as an international crisis that's happening within us. So thank you for bringing these matters to our attention for us to talk to you today about. I also need to thank, because this town hall came together literally in a matter of hours, I want to thank our staff, our College of Education staff, the Dean's Office for rolling out the communications, our IT partners for making sure everything is in place, as well as our online programs. So thank you to those, as well as the staff who I've heard from saying that we also needed this kind of a town hall here. As well as it seems in many ways, right, we've regressed racially and racial progress. What does that mean? Racial regress. A student of mine many years ago raised that very question. At the same time, in a matter of a week and a half, we've heard of the developments within the Supreme Court in terms of maintaining rights for LGBTQ for employment, as well as this morning, the Supreme Court and DACA. So there are those things happening, but we also hear you when the questions are asked, where do we go from here, right? As Dr. King had so presciently provided many decades ago, where do we go from here? I think many of us know where we want to go from here. I think the other question too is, how do we want to go from here? And that is a question that a number of you have also raised. How do we move from this moment so that it goes beyond the statements that are provided, because statements are easily made. How do we move that into the kind of structural changes that are needed at this moment? So with that, and I don't want to delay this anymore, what we're going to do, if we can go to the brief agenda at this moment, it's a loose structure. So what we have, it will change. Am I sharing my screen? So what we're going to have is, thank you. So we're going to have Dean Anderson provide some remarks, reflections on the state of the world that only he can, and followed by a faculty roundtable that we have with Dr. Spann, Gutierrez, Dixon, Hobson, and Trent. And just to thank them for their participation, but also to acknowledge that we have many faculty in our college who also have been doing research in these areas for many decades. So it's also to acknowledge their work, and it's not in any way to exclude anyone. So with that, Dr. Anderson.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me well? You can?
Yes, audio's clear.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to say thanks to everyone for joining us for this town hall meeting, and special thanks to the organizers and for the invitation to be a part of this. As Yoon said, we have many, many faculty and students in our college who have been committed to work around social justice, equality, and the examination of systemic racism inside of education and outside for a very long time. So this is a great time for us to reflect on the work that we do, to recommit ourselves to doing the kind of work that is necessary to answer some important questions. If you would permit me, I'd like to begin with a personal story, sort of remind you just how ancient I am. But at any rate, a lot of people have been comparing this moment to the murder of Emmett Till. And I recall that very vividly because Emmett Till was murdered in August, and it was only a couple of weeks or so before I was scheduled to begin the 5th grade. And I was 10 years old. And as some of you know, his mother decided to publish his mutilated body in Jet magazine at that time. And Jet magazine was one of the magazines that we got on a regular basis. Ebony and Jet were the magazines that carried all the news about African Americans in the country, from the celebrities to just news about everything. And so we got the Jet magazine and I was thumbing through it. I don't know if it was on the front cover or somewhere in there. And I saw this mutilated body. And it was such shock to a 10-year-old. And I just had recurring nightmares about being in the clutches of the Klan after seeing that picture. And so when I saw the 5th-year-old girl who asked the police, "Will you shoot me?" or it just reminded me that this moment is going to have a lot of mental stress on very young people, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and those are the individuals who will be returning to school, K-12, in the fall. And I think all of us who are involved in education should be prepared to look out for them, to support them, and to understand the mental stress that many of them will be under. And it's one thing to say that they should go to school, get their work done, and focus on academic achievement, but they can't set aside the kind of trauma they've seen and have witnessed over the past several weeks. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we have to deal with the generation now, much like the Emmett Till generation. And it was interesting because those of us who were the same age, we never talked to each other about the trauma we were going through, never talked to each other about the kind of nightmares we had. But late in life, when we had conversations, and I guess was old enough, mature enough, or brave enough, courageous enough to talk about it, we realized that we all went through a certain kind of mental stress, a certain kind of trauma because of what happened in that case. And I think George Floyd and Aubrey and Rayshard and others are going to send a lot of young people through the same kind of mental stress. So one thing we need to do is talk to our teachers, our school leaders, and as well as our researchers and others who will be in schools about the generation that will be coming into K-12, as well as the ones who will come back to campus. Our collegiate age students have seen resistance and movements, and they will come back with a different mindset as well. So some of the work that we do is to support K-12 population as well as students in our own classes. So we should think long and hard about how we will be prepared to do that. I think that's going to be one of our major assignments or obligations come this fall. The other thing I think, and the question's been asked, is this time different? Well, I think it is. I've been listening to a lot of people, sort of reflecting on my own years, but also listening to people like Clyburn and John Lewis. They were co-founders of SNCC, the Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that led the voter registration drives throughout the South and were part of the central to the civil rights movement. And Clyburn and Lewis think that this is different than anything they've seen since that time. So yes, it is a different time, and we should think about how do we make the right choices? How do we clarify things? How do we make the right commitments to take advantage of what seems to be a very different time? And clearly what we're getting in the opinion polls is very different than anything we've gotten in the last several decades. The vast amount of Americans who have taken notice and who actually support everything from Black Lives Matters to reforming the criminal justice systems, to taking a closer look, a deeper look at systemic racism, is different. So we have to think about how do we seize the time. Clyburn and Lewis have already warned us that any social movement can be hijacked. They think that the one they started was hijacked and eventually led in a different pathway. So we want to make sure that we think about what we want to commit to, be persistent, and stay the course in order to keep our eyes on the prize that we define. The other thing I think that is going to be critical is that, I'm reminded now of a song by Bob Dylan called "The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll." Well, Hattie Carroll was a real figure, and she was serving as a maid in a high society gathering, and a 24-year-old rich tobacco farmer, at least the heir of tobacco enterprise, was upset that she was not responding to him fast enough, and he took his cane and killed her on the spot. And Dylan wrote a song about it. And when you read the beginning of it or hear the beginning of it, he has a refrain, and the refrain goes something like this, if I remember it. It says, "You who would philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears, take the rag away from your face, because now is not the time for your tears." And you're reading that thinking, well, why isn't this not the time for your tears? I mean, this innocent woman has been murdered. And he keeps going through the different stages of what happened after that. The time that the murderer, William Zanzinger, was arrested and taken to jail and then to court, and finally gets to the end of the song when this man was given a sentence of about 2 months for having murdered her. And then he changed the refrain a bit, and he says, "Ye who would philosophize disgrace and criticize all fears, bury the rag deep in your face, because now is the time for your tears." What that means for me is that we have to brace ourselves for the shock. George Floyd's murderer has not gone to trial yet, and Rayshard Brooks' murderers have not gone to trial yet, and Breonna Taylor's, they've not gone to trial yet. We know what happened with Rodney King, even with Emmett Till. They were tried and acquitted, and then they, in order to make some money for themselves, gave a story to Life magazine and confessed to the murderers. And so the point that Dylan is making, this point that I want to emphasize, is that we also need to brace ourselves for what I call the aftershocks. It is quite possible that the police officer in Minneapolis get their trial moved to a venue, something like Simi Valley, which in the case of Rodney King, you get a hung jury, you get an acquittal. And then there's a second wave of trauma and disappointment, pain and tears. And for the young people that we have to deal with, and I'm thinking again about, the 6-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, the 15-year-olds who will be in our K-12 system, as well as our own students on campus. What they will have to deal with is something that we should be prepared again to support them through that. We shouldn't anticipate or prefigure an outcome. We don't know what the outcome would be. When we look at our history, we know that it could go in many directions. And I was listening to the case of Rayshard Brooks, and the prosecuting attorney said that he tried 40 cases and have not gotten a conviction in any of them. So it's quite unusual that we get justice, in other words. And so we should prepare for either outcome. And when we support our young people, we may get justice, we may not. And if we don't, it's going to be quite a trauma for them to deal with. I think that. The other thing I want to say is that we have work to do within our college. We have research to do. We have teaching to do. We're now hearing a lot about terms like systemic racism and institutional racism. I would guess that if you talk to not just the average citizen, politician, business person, or people in many walks of life, and you just said to them, what do you think people mean by systemic racism? And could you give me some examples? How would you define institutional racism? And could you give me a case study where we could see the existence of institutional racism, how it operates, and to think about interventions and so forth? I think what we likely learn is most people have not been educated in this way. And they don't have a way to really possess and understand the concepts that are being thrown around. But I do know it's the kind of work that we do. It's the kind of work that exists among our faculty, our graduate students, and so forth. But I think it's important to make this kind of work ordinary and a part of the basic conversations. It shouldn't be something that's a set aside or something that seems like it's alien or it comes from nowhere. It should be a part of our ordinary conversation. An understanding of systemic racism and understanding of institutional racism should be something that is ordinary in our education, and that our teachers who leave our college of education, graduate students who get their degrees, and the faculty and the kind of work that we do, it should be interwoven, basic, central to the work that we do in a way that that we can actually have intervention. And one of the things that that I've seen of late that I use in my class, which is a good example of institutional racism, is called Long Island Divided. And it was a video documentary on the real estate agents in Long Island. It's a kind of undercover documentary, but it's a clear-cut demonstration of how systemic racism and institutional racism, how they operate. Because here you have major real estate corporations where the agents are steering people into neighborhoods based on ethnicity. And they do it in a regular, routine, organizational fashion. And so you have to be able to show people up close and personal that this is what we mean by systemic racism. This is what we mean by institutional racism. This is how it operates. And the other thing, and then we can go to the next stage to say, well, what can you do to stop this? And the same question that comes up with police brutality. Once you make it quite apparent and quite clear, you can begin to point to interventions. What should we do to real estate agents that regularly and in a routine organizational fashion steer people in the neighborhoods based on ethnicity, not on income, not on any kind of individual attributes or merit, but just on the idea that neighborhoods should be segregated and somehow they have the responsibility to maintain that. What kind of legal action should we take? What kind of training should there be for real estate agents? What kind of programs they should go through? We really have to take a very careful look at systemic racism and institutional racism, because ultimately we want to have the kind of interventions to end it. And you can't end it with slogans. You can't just throw them around. You have to know exactly what they mean. And the other thing I would say, and I would add, is that we will know that the society is more seriously interested in ending systemic racism and institutional racism when they began to support the kind of interventions that can bring about change. Another thing about my own background, when I was an assistant professor here, I actually worked with the late Jerry Hirsch in psychology to get a grant funded by the National Institute of Mental Health to study institutional racism. And so we had a grant with both pre-doctoral trainees and postdoctoral trainees and a set of faculty who were looking at that. It's the only time that I know in American history that any funding agency, whether it was a private foundation or a federal agency, actually funded a grant to study institutional racism. We should actually get support for the kind of research we should do. And, if it's something as simple as writing the congressperson or whatever to say, if you want to end systemic racism, if you want to end institutional racism, that one of the things you might want to do in higher education is fund the kind of research that brings about the understanding as well as some of the solutions to it. Because in most cases, federal governments, state governments, as well as local governments tend to fund the kinds of things that they really want to change. And so I would say that we should seize the time here by saying we can't just use slogans and concepts. We need some very, very serious research on these questions, as well as some, serious teaching and program development as well. But I would like to see a lot more research funded for the kind of work that we do in the College of Education, whether it's done within the university, whether it's done with agencies like the Illinois State Board of Education. I mean, there's a lot of systemic racism in the field of education, as we know. I think about studies like the Sharon Hopper studies on suspension and expulsions. I mean, it's pretty surprising, astonishing what he found. And the Yale study that looked at pre-K education and unconscious bias. I was surprised to know that 54% of all the pre-K students who are suspended in US schools are African-American. And I'm not even sure why pre-K kids are being suspended and expelled, but there are faculty within our college in early childhood and other areas that do have an understanding. But we need to get to the bottom of these problems and think about ways in which we can have interventions to change them. And so we would just limit ourselves for a moment to look at systemic racism, institutional racism in education. Where is the research to fund this? We know that beginning in 1980, and Trent was part of this as well, the federal government stopped funding research on school desegregation. They said, we don't need to study that. Well, what has happened in the years since then, the decades since then, is simply an intensification of school segregation throughout the country. And so you pay the price when you decide that something is not worthy of research. And you also display a set of values when you say, we don't want to study this. And I think I worry a bit about what will happen with the congressional acts and the bills that want to collect more data. Will they really look closely at police brutality? Will they really look closely at training? And I would say also, not only police in the society and the larger community, we have a lot of police in our schools as well. And so there are a lot of schools that have police on duty. And we've seen the anecdotal, experiences of 5-year-olds or even young, about that age being handcuffed and taken out of schools. We've seen those, but we don't know to what extent is it pervasive, to what extent do children who are in schools where you have a significant police presence walk in fearful of them? How does that affect their day-to-day sort of contemplation, their study? Do they worry about that? Are they like the 5-year-old who says, are you going to shoot me? We should look at police in our schools as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm not disappointed. I'm not sort of tired of what we're doing, because I'm excited about the kind of people that we have, the kind of work that we do. And I think it's important, and I think it can make a difference in the long run. So I won't go any further than this. You have a wonderful panel who know a lot more about this than I do. At least one of them I know is the same age as I am, and so has gone through similar kinds of experiences. So I'm quite looking forward to what they have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And of course, you'll also be participating when we come back full circle, mainly because there are questions that I am noticing on the Q&A as well as the chat box. But so this is the order that we're going to go in. there's just some general questions that were set for them to address so that we can stay focused. And based on the kinds of concerns and questions that we've already been hearing, of course, they're not wedded to any the strictures of the questions posed. But given their areas of expertise, we're going to have Dr. Span go first in terms of what are those historical contexts that we also should be aware of, as well as the historical lessons. And I've asked all the panelists too, to what is that one actionable item that can be done, right? Because that's the other thing. What can be done almost immediately, right? In the context and in the spheres of influence that we occupy. So with that, we'll go with Dr. Span.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. I don't, I think Dr. Anderson really framed the discussion excellently. And I don't want to go probably any further than the directions that he went, but I do think two things that come to mind. I think for the everyday person, we have to educate ourselves as to what is the history of the United States, not just with regards to understanding race and its impact, but just the way we've been indifferent toward one another and how cumulatively that has impacted us. And the moments in American history where there has been intentionality and accountability to be more intentional and mindful and respecting of others, and the policies that would be developed from that. And so if you think about what we have learned in the about the American past, and I ask you a series of questions as it relates to, say, the past of indigenous people or Latinx people or African Americans or people with disabilities, and say, share with me their history, your understanding of their existence, how they started off in this country, how through chronology they proceeded in this country, and how they are and who they are today. Most would be hard pressed to tell that story. We don't know those histories. And so when we think of how we come to learn about ourselves, if anything, we know more about the stereotypes of those groups. That people probably can name 5 stereotypes faster than they can name 5 contributions or 5 contributing members from those groups. And so we have to begin to rethink the way we think about who we are and how we've come to be, and ask ourselves, how is it that we can get this far in our adult lives and not know any of this? Many people are listening today are graduate students, and they may not have even been exposed to that as undergraduate students. We know in K through 12 education systems, these aren't topics that are taught often. If they are taught, they're not taught in consistent ways. So we have to remind people that in order to truly impact change, truly the passion has to be there. The protest is there right now. I just wrote an essay on it. But the protest has to be tied to politics and policy, in addition to education. And so we have to figure out that fundamental understanding. We're in the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. This is the year, it came in 1620, and here we are in 2020. And we had Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did a wonderful cover of the 400th anniversary of Africans in America and their arrival in 1619, a year that predates the Mayflower. But again, most of us would be hard pressed to recall the name of the ship that brought those first Africans to Virginia. And it's like, how do you have 2 histories, 2 ships, one that symbolically is seen as the definition of freedom, the Mayflower, and the slave ship, which is not just symbolically, categorically the definition of slavery. And they're there docking the shores of what would become the United States at the same time. And we only know half the story. And in that way, how did we create this gap, this understanding, this racial value gap? So we have to really rethink the way we think about these things and educate ourselves. The beauty of it is the breadcrumbs are all there. We have all the archival evidence and pieces of the puzzle to tell these stories. And there are historians and social scientists that have gone through the process of drafting these narratives and histories. And there are educators that are going through the process of teaching it, but it's all been done in piecemeal ways. I think for me as a historian, it would be nice if we could use our collective intelligence to find a way to tell that story in more universal ways. So the everyday person is equipped with the knowledge and skills and disposition, as Anderson said, to not just understand what systemic racism is or institutional racism, but to know how to systematically tackle it when they see it, and know how to start the process of eradicating it. So thinking of first like coronavirus here, our goal is to identify it and minimize it and mitigate it and eradicate it. And that's kind of be a long-standing plan here, an effective one for that virus. I think that plan would be as effective for ending the virus of racism as well. And so, at that point, I think I will stop. But I do think that we are in a moment that will continue to move into a movement. And as it moves through that movement, we have to remind everybody that you have to be intentional to understand what is happening and then be intentional as to go about shaping the society that you want to live in. And that will take both, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that's going to take time and patience and consideration for others, maybe even removal of some opportunities for yourself to advance the needs and opportunities of others. And we have to be prepared to engage in that capacity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was certainly important reminders for us all. All right. So next we have Dr. Gutierrez, who, of course, I provided the heavy task, right? How do we transform teacher education? But some questions that have also come in that is very relevant is in terms of even as early as preschool age, right? How do we begin to instill these dispositions?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to first just start by honoring the land where we're gathered and pay my respects to those who fought to nurture and to protect these lands. We are on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. And these indigenous communities have continued to maintain their connection spiritually and physically to these lands, even when we've been forced to be, when communities have been forced to be removed, when nations have been removed. And I think it's important to bring this up not just because of the history of the history of the University of Illinois with respect to indigenous communities, but to understand that the Black Lives Matter movement is intricately connected to the lives of indigenous people. After all, the United States history is one of stolen hands working stolen lands. So understanding this kind of settler native slave triad is really important for us, and not thinking about separating these ideas. For me, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have to move beyond, in terms of education and teacher education, we have to move beyond the idea that we're all trying to get the right method. And Lilia Bartolome has really rightly, I'm not sure somebody's alarm is going on, has very rightly pointed out the idea of that we need to move beyond a methods fetish. We need to address the systems of oppression. And that methods fetish just basically is saying that we need to be able to say it's not about getting the right curriculum down alone when there are systemic things about education that matter. So I think one of the things that as an actionable item is just for teachers and those who are in education to continue to remember that it's not just about reforming what happens in the classroom, but it's about thinking about how do we take down systems. I think we have, most people have knowledge in the College of Education about the history of funds of knowledge and culturally relevant teaching. And I think in the same way that we think about the labor unions giving us the right to a weekend and having a 40-hour work week, I think we can thank Indigenous communities and Black communities communities of color who have reminded us that the curriculum is not relevant to us. And so there's this idea of making sure that the curriculum can be a window and mirror. And that helps everybody because in terms of humanity, we all need to be able to see ourselves and see another version of the world outside of us. But I think that it requires much more than thinking about how do I get to these best practices? How do I do these things that are going to be good for my students, and really involves political clarity. I think back to the work of Tamara Babouf-Laventant, who was studying Black teachers in schools that were segregated in the South. And she was showing that in some ways it was about culturally relevance, but it was more for her about being politically relevant. And so teachers who understood why they were teaching, what they were teaching about, for what purpose, and for whom, who were they holding themselves accountable to, this was all part and parcel with what that kind of teaching meant, and that it wasn't just what practices they were doing. I also think it's really important for us to think about, as teachers and in teacher education and just as educators in general, that when we start to think about being more inclusive, I think it's too easy for people to go to the images that are out there, to the trauma, to the oppression that Black communities and Indigenous communities have suffered, and not to center Black joy and creativity. I think, for example, of my own children who have taken courses in African American literature, in Chicano literature, and Indigenous community literature, and in those courses, they're often reading books like Invisible Man, Native Son, things that are one version of what the Black experience has been about, but not all of it. And so, where is the attention to the Renaissance, to the arts, to the resistance, to things that are also part of the humanity of Black and Indigenous people? Our protests today, have a long history, all the way back to the Soweto strikes in South Africa, where when we think about what happened in education there, students were not just demanding a better education, they literally took over the schools. They literally took over teaching each other. They occupied the schools and took over those schools. In terms of the Chicano walkouts, we had the East LA Garfield students who did the same thing, who kind of had a set of demands, chained themselves to a community space where the school council was meeting and wasn't willing to meet their demands, and ended up, going to jail for this. But I think it's an important moment for us to be thinking about, yes, this moment is different, but I think that we have to, and the window has opened. There's a small window open for us right now where people are feeling they want to attend to something, but I think that we need to dream bigger. I think that we need to go back and look at the demands that those students have put forward, and to honor the deaths and the brutality and the backlash that those student communities got because they spoke up and because they had an explicit list of demands and then took over schools, and say, how can we dream bigger? Because if we don't dream bigger, we know that each of these moments has been a rebellion. And I think that's what we're in now. We're in a rebellious moment. We're not in a revolution. We're not yet in a revolution because it's not yet happening. We have people in the streets who are saying they want to defund the police, they want to eliminate the school resource officers, and I think that's fantastic. That's a great start. But we need to ask ourselves, can we dream bigger? Within the sciences, can we dream bigger than just having our community, our Black communities, our Indigenous communities have access and achievement and representation in the sciences? Are we actually willing to rethink how education can work? Along the lines of Bettina Love's work, can we think of an abolitionist teaching? What might learning look like if it centered mattering and thriving for Black and Indigenous students? What would it look like if we supported all students to be in right relation with others, including other than human relations? What would it look like if it wasn't happening in schools? Would school not even be carved up in age groups or subject matters? Or what would be the role of assessment? Would assessment relate more towards mental sovereignty and to self-determination, as opposed to a competitive motion that forces people to compete for the winner of a system that is already a bad system? I want to shift just to talk a little bit about the sciences, and in what way are the sciences kind of in collusion with anti-Blackness and colonialism, because I think it's something that people aren't able to kind of deconstruct. Sandra Harding gives us the concept of the God trick. Something that's very prominent within the sciences is the notion of universalism. and abstraction. And I would argue that it's this universalism that's actually a form of colonialism. When we try to get to the notion of best practices, we are actually saying that people are able to do this God trick that Sandra Harding talks about, where she says that somebody could play God and they could be somewhere else and could be viewing the world and telling other people from some kind of neutral space, they're telling other people what the world looks like. That's what best practices does. It's a form of colonialism because it's telling people that there's one way of practicing that fits everyone, and place doesn't matter and people don't matter. And that's a form of dehumanization. In the sciences, we also have the notion of misconceptions. We say students have misconceptions about whatever, it's something in geometry, something in algebra. And we go into teaching with this notion that we need to correct students from those misconceptions because that's an equity issue, because we don't want them to be building their knowledge on faulty grounds. But it's actually this idea of misconceptions that's, again, a form of oppression or violence or colonialism, because it's saying, rather than us as teachers stopping and standing within the shoes of our students, we are instead saying, you need to come to my way of viewing the world. And this is the correct way to view the world. We know historically that in mathematics, this is how we've gotten complex numbers. That's how we've gotten multiple sizes of infinity. It's how we've gotten non-Euclidean geometry. So this idea that people have misconceptions as opposed to people just having conceptions is an important one. We also tend to think about naming the contributions in science around Europeans, and that's another form of anti-Blackness and colonialism. In the 1830s, Black scientists such as Martin Delany and Sarah Mapps Douglas used their discipline to support the arguments for emancipation. So, for example, astronomy was actually developed to make more efficient the export of labor. And so these Black scientists instead delivered scientific lectures that included astronomy and maps to help other people chart their course for freedom. And they had Black girls use their own bodies as anatomical models. So one of the problems with science that I think people should understand is that we act as if science in itself is good, that science is for progress. And so our relationship with science is a good one. And it's just when people apply science in the wrong ways. So you have these eugenics movements, or you have other things that we say it's a bad application. But actually, we need to be questioning what counts as science. What are the ways in which the current version of science is actually erasing more complete ways of knowing? So again, I think it's important for us to be able to name that there are things like quantum mechanics that was originally developed and had very informed and deep connections to philosophical questions like ontology and the observer and the observed and the nature of reality. But in the process of finding practical applications, especially militaristic ones, it led to the kind of shut up and calculate perspective that's common today. And so we have the sciences trying to impinge on other areas like social behavior, and trying to determine and dictate and model what should happen when we actually understand that in terms of human living beings, the sciences cannot actually accurately model something that is not driven by universal algorithms. It misses the ethics, it misses ceremony, it misses our place in the world, it misses the systems thinking that many Indigenous communities already do, and where we are learning from our other than human relations.
Great, thank you.
So I think just to end, I would just say that drawing from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel, he says, in a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And so I ask each of us to say, what's our responsibility to not just becoming aware of these ideas, but thinking about what is our political clarity in our teaching, in our role as educators, and how is part of that political clarity standing up to what counts as the sciences and this notion of universality.
Important message, thank you. And I think it really highlights the point that education and teaching is a political endeavor, even though that's not the way that it's always taught to us, but that really is how that evolves. All right, thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Adrian Dixon, who will be speaking from her point of expertise, but also because questions have come in terms of what can whites do beyond statements to move towards being at the center to help dismantle white supremacy, as well as the role of educational researchers and scholars to bring to bear the system of inequality in our schooling systems. You're muted.
Thank you. So I'll pick up the research piece. I think, and I was just talking actually before the Zoom, I was talking to some students about our research and the role of race research. And the pushback. I noticed a question I think Nathan asked about the pushback. And so I work from a space of critical race theory, where we work under a set of assumptions. And so we work under the assumption that the US, that racism is a normal part of American society. It has been since the inception. That race, although a social construct, meaning race as a biological construct, and I appreciate Rochelle's commentary about science and the role of science and math. Although, race doesn't exist as a biological concept, clearly it does in terms of a social construct, in that it shapes people's lives. So as a researcher, how do we operationalize those ideas? What is it, so as a critical race theory researcher, those are the premises on which I stand. I assume that when I go into a school, it's going to reflect the general ideology and the ethos of the United States. We have a history. This is over 300 years. So what I'm trying to understand is how does this belief about racial inferiority and racial superiority hierarchies, how does that manifest? Because I already assume that it's there. Again, we have enough evidence of it, and certainly our faculty, there's a range of us who have kind of been able to document that and understand it. And so that's what I stand on. And so I don't presume to be working in a space where my doctoral advisor is Gloria Ladson-Billings. And one of the things she said to me was that she wasn't going to convince white people of anything anymore. Like that wasn't going to be her research, was to convince white people that that Black students are smart, that Black families are good, that Black communities are healthy. Like that's not the work. And so I think that our role as researchers is not to work in a space where you're trying to convince people of your humanity or your worth or your intelligence, or that's not our work. And to stand, from my purview as a critical race theory scholar, and to stand on this notion that race and racism are constructs that operate in every space. And what I'm trying to understand is how they manifest in particular spaces. So, and I'm increasingly more interested in how people are organizing to resist the race, how race and racism are shaping them. And so it's a rejection of, because Nathan's question was, how do you respond to people who say that your work is pessimistic? Well, we're in a current context where why, if you're on the street and somebody's foot is literally on your neck, what are you going to be happy about? So the work isn't to paint a rosy picture, right? People are living like this. People are struggling every day. And some are much more susceptible and vulnerable to violence than others. That's the reality of life. And this notion of safety is a privilege. The elite can sit and say that they're safe. For everybody else, it's just, when is the next thing going to happen? And the next thing could be physically violent, or it could be economically, it could destroy you economically. And so that's the reality in which more people live in than not. And And so how do we, as researchers, document it? Because it is important to document, because there are far too many people who want to dismiss as if it's not real. And for you all as researchers, you live in a moment now where you can really kind of state that, right? So more people are willing to, for whatever reason, maybe it's just that's the sentiment of the moment, but they're willing to acknowledge that that racism, systemic racism, which is, it cuts across. So someone asked, what is systemic racism and what is institutional racism? So systemic racism is something that we can think of the police department as a part of a system in a city municipality where there's, racism that exists, institutionalized, where a police officer can never be found guilty of murder because the presumption is that their lives and their sense of fear trumps anyone else's. So Rayshard Brooks, who legitimately, we're in the midst of uprising across the country over the death of George Floyd. Rayshard Brooks, and this is something, again, that's unknowable, but he could have legitimately been afraid of the police. But his fear doesn't register, right? His fear isn't cognizable. What is cognizable is that the police officer could claim a fear that would then justify shooting someone in the back. And so it's kind of trying to, you all are in a moment where raising critical questions and engaging in research that, again, tries to uncover and document things that processes, policies, practices that have long been cast as benign. You're in a moment where you can elevate that and question and push. And you can reject ideas or reject criticisms that the work is pessimistic. I mean, this is the context that we're in now. The Brooks, Brooks's children, Floyd's children, family, they'll never see them again. That's not happy, right? There's how are we gonna run around and be happy? And we have these two very high profile deaths. Breonna Taylor's mother will never see her again. Who's running around happy about that? So why are you asking me to be to kind of paint a rosy picture when people are vulnerable and they're dying at the hands of the state? And we can, think about small children, school-age children who are in school who are vulnerable to the police, right? The teachers and school leaders can say they were out of control, and then you have small kindergartners in handcuffs, and their fears are not more important than this notion of being out of control that school leaders have decided, and the sense of decorum that schools have cast. So this is a moment to raise the critical questions, to do the critical research, and to reject out of hand. I reject this notion of objectivity, reject this idea that the work has to paint a rosy picture, and that that you have a responsibility to make anyone feel good about the state of racism and oppression and state violence. I'll stop.
Great, thank you. And certainly as the questions and the comments come in, we will work certainly in ways to address those. And Dr. Hobson will be featured next to talk about the nature of the movement in a way that it's reached global, right, awareness of anti-Black violence and racism. So thank you, Dr. Hobson.
No, thank you. Does this sound, is it clear enough? Cool. Just a vote of thanks to start off with to my colleagues in the College of Ed, and particularly those of you who are leading out this effort and shook enough trees for this to happen. Students, department, just the knowledge base and the contributions of colleagues at the University of Illinois, I think, are phenomenal. And I'll explain maybe in answering those two questions what I'm referring to, Yoon, as well, and colleagues. And also, I take seriously the Dean's Challenge that he started in the beginning. What choices are we making? What commitments will we make? And I'm referring to, and also the challenge he made regarding penetrating funding streams, rethinking our practices, curricular and policy levers to attack systemic and institutional racism. So I take those challenges seriously. And it's with these comments that I'll briefly address in the 4 or so 5 minutes that I have left. I was asked to address or protest different in this given global context, scope, attention to worldwide racial inequality, and also what new research possibilities can arise from the moment. And I do that also by thanking the panelists, but not repeating very much, both span for your historical precedent. Gutierrez, for your recognition of the land acknowledgement, so getting that out for sure, and recognition of what that's about, but also beyond the methods fetish, thinking systemically, dreaming bigger, thinking about recentering BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, creativity, strength over deficits. Thank you for that. And of course, AD as well, in terms of the role of critical race theory and other intersectional knowledge bases, the role of questioning what's proper, what's expected, what's norm, and interrupting and disrupting those vestiges, hierarchies, and privileges, systems of race that put forth dominant hierarchies, particularly around whiteness. So thank you for all that. So I'll just say briefly, that I think it's important for us to do a few things as we think about the protests and this kind of current global attention and around racial inequalities. One is recognize that and highlight the long-standing cumulative pattern of racial profiling and legal policing. AD spoke about it, and I think it's important to highlight. Thanks to Faye Harrison for her article, for example, one of our own African-American professors who wrote a recent op-ed in Slovakia newspaper, maybe about a week ago, when she spoke about the convergence of multiple crises. And so on one hand, we were dealing with the notion of this COVID, the realities of COVID, and then we realized that the COVID wasn't hitting everyone, and the intersections, realizing we're at the epicenter of this global pandemic over China, Italy, and Brazil, but also specific populations are finding themselves also converge around these crises. Secondly, to think about the violence that's spurred most recently through the occupant at 1600 by his xenophobic and racist behaviors, things and attitudes that he's encouraging, that sort of that hate, that anger. And also it's important for us to think, because the global world is watching these things, and so it's important for us to consider these things. The third thing is this kind of social economic decline that's been happening recently that's kind of affecting our job loss and loss of income, loss of quality of life, depression-like indices around employment, dependence on food banks, mutual aid, and so forth. And just thinking about that, kind of those patterns. Secondly, it's important for us to highlight the role of thoughtful, committed citizens to change the world, as Margaret Mead speaks. And, we can just speak for a minute about what I think was happening in sport. That kind of asinine comment that was put to LeBron James about shut up and dribble. And imagine if they just told us as educators to shut up and teach, and just the reaction, but just seeing the solidarity across global nation states. But the solidarity is quite interesting because, and I'll come back to this, because the solidarity, folk are picking up on certain things. Yes, they're, and maybe you're watching more the New York Times and Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune, and you're watching at BBC and or other newspapers and agencies and Al Jazeera's and others, and hard to find news and so forth. But you're realizing that stories are being told in different places differently. And I think part of the recognition of it as well is the solidarity across global nation states around a lot of these issues. And I'll come back to that, both the fact that multiple institutions are recognizing these profound systemic inequalities, and they're going out. They're scientific institutions. Maybe you saw the call recently from the geoscience scientists of color, speaking to some of the things that Prof. Gutierrez is speaking to. But just multiple individual statements and departments. We have, I saw one this morning from an alumna of our program, actually at another institution, writing on behalf of her and a few other colleagues, right? Individual, departmental, institutional efforts of solidarity. But part of it that we're seeing as well, and I think part of it for those of us who want to study these things, and these are certainly things that we ought to be thinking about later, is kind of what does it mean in terms of these state-sanctioned violence that we're responding to? What does it mean when someone says out loud that they want to have a high-ranking official say looting and shooting references to rhetoric and both implementation? I mean, what does that speak about social control, law and order in the context, not only in terms of our public society, but also our classrooms? I think the third thing that we have to highlight as well is and this is hats off to visual capitalists, some of you who are data viz method geeks who like to follow different aspects of data being displayed. Visual capitalists had most recently a summary of the last 2 decades of civil unrest in the United States. They were economic and social. Think Occupy Wall Street, think Dakota Access Pipeline. They were sports and events related, but those around championships. I mean, those folk in Philadelphia after sports teams win things, okay, that's another set of riots. The politically motivated civil unrest, for example, following the election of the current president in 2016, or the Bundy standoff in Nevada over that. And then the fourth one was the reaction to police actions. I mean, this has been the biggest flashpoint, and it's issues out of the post-Floyd that we find ourselves thinking back, and also thinking back not just to Till, but over the last 400 years. And the fourth thing relative to these global protests, and I think the dean spoke to it, was highlighting, and this is most important as well relative to the aftershock, the insidious nature of America's intractable problem that continues to fund, support, police, legislate, and lynch Black and brown communities in the manner and application of white cultural supremacy, privilege, and preeminence in our institutions and on our streets. So these anti-Black protests, not by mobs, meant by mobs in the UK and the US in particular, this what Van Jones describes as this toxic mix of culprits responsible for mob violence. And then notice, it was only Greg Popovich, the San Antonio Spurs coach, who sort of in a recent op-ed wrote about the particularity of the nonchalant way that the officer knelt, and likened it to the image that we see in the faces of you think about Billie Holiday's strange feuds and the lynching that goes on. And so those 4 things are tying us in different ways around the world, and people are reminding ourselves. The second important question was about new research possibilities. And so I'll finish with these maybe 3 or 4 things here. One, going back to the dean as well in terms of finding solutions, but highlighting funding agencies that have created mechanisms and structure to support this type of work. Both the immediacy of the moment, like the Russell Sage, the Spencers, the NSFs, the NIHs, and the College of Ed, right, in terms of supporting immediate and emergency research that speak to a specific wicked problem in our society, but also the longstanding nature of these intractable problems. Just because these agencies put out these emergency calls doesn't mean that these things haven't been going on for hundreds of years. There are some agencies that are doing some really great things, and I think part of it is recognizing that, like, for example, in the National Education Association space, there's a Leaders for Social Justice that's training groups of teachers around all our 50 states to think about racial equity and how to apply it over the course of a year. Kellogg Foundation is got a national race and reconciliation project right now that's funding 14 agencies in the core of several millions around the country that are dealing with these issues of truth, race, and reconciliation. These are important things to know. The second thing in terms of research possibilities is to highlight the century-old, for you historical buffs, but also kind of thinking about it in a contemporary way, these old set of problems and questions that are articulated through poems and prose in our tradition. I mean, you can look at the comedy. Check out Dave Chappelle's 846 recently. That's hot. That's some comedy. Some prose. Harlem Renaissance. I mean, if you can't help but thinking about 100 years of his call in the early 20th century around if we must die, and I'm going to read those first 4 lines. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in a glorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making them mock at our cursed lot. You know, how could you not? I mean, what was going on in Claude McKay's life and what was going on in the Black experience 100 years ago that would necessitate a poem like that. And so, or we got Nina Simone, Mississippi Goddamn. I mean, you can play it while you listen to the Bob Dylan song that the dean shared. But the Du Boisian work, the Carter G. Woodson work, the work that our own dean, Asa Hilliard, Barbara Sizemore, that really have tried to been asking questions and rethinking for 100 years, understanding the myths, education, the decolonization, the weaponization of our reform toward Black and brown bodies. That's not new. Thirdly, is just to highlight the role of building more critical research methods, quant mixed, that expose us to new questions around these intractable racial issues and problems around inequity in the United States. For example, the Institute for Critical Computational Mixed Methods, put together by a group of really talented colleagues out of Vanderbilt, Penn and WashU, have a series of Spencer and NSF and William T. Grant Funding Foundation to really think about how to advance the presence of scholars in data science, particularly scholars of color, and also using these methods to dismantle structural inequalities. I mean, that's real. The multiple journals, book volumes that deliberately and intentionally advance our complex ways of understanding epistemologies, methods, ontologies in the midst of racial, cultural identity. And that stuff is out there. And so I think part of what we continue to do is kind of continue to educate ourselves, but also play a role in advancing new research possibilities for our school and for the world.
Thank you, Dr. Hobson. And can't say enough the importance of self-education in this process. You have access to the world at your fingertips with Google now that many of us didn't have, right, in our younger years. So for those asking for help in terms of what can we do, there's a start right there, right? So resources that are available that have been provided to you in this moment. So thank you for that and for the reminders. And to also note from what Dr. Dixon has noted, as well with Dr. Gutierrez, that there is rigor in the research that we do. Okay, so we also need to distinguish between objectivity, which has already been debunked on so many different levels over the past decades, with the kind of research rigor that it takes to do also the kind of work that so many of us are doing. All right, Dr. Trent, words of wisdom in your wisdom self. And please unmute yourself first.
Listening to my colleagues who have already presented, I think your cups of wisdom runneth over. But again, thank you, Yoon, for responding. Yoon and I shared a conversation over Theo coming to us and saying, there are rumors, there are murmurs, do we have a wellness program for our students? And so I called Yoon, because I didn't know, but I knew we were trying to be responsive under these times of COVID to the various disruptions in our students' lives. And that's always been a characteristic of the department, that we try to be responsive to the challenges that our students confront. I don't have a lot to add to what's been said, but I want to start with hopefully encouraging all of you to download the TED Talk by David Williams. David Williams is a sociologist on the faculty at Harvard University, and David has done a collection of studies now and articles that make clear the harmfulness of racism to our mental health as a community of color. I mean, the evidence is abundant that the racism is not just hurtful in terms of its emotions, but it's harmful in terms of the prolonged exposure we have to it and how it disrupts our lives and the kinds of stresses that it introduces. I don't know the percentages that it accounts for the hypertension or the heart diseases those are evidence of the harm that it does. And the structures that are in place, when Jim talks about systemic and we talk about institutional, it's important to understand that, at least as we sociologists talk about it, those social structures are as real and as tangible as any physical structure you want to run in. They persist over time, they persist in largely the same fashion. And, you know, the experiences that King and John Lewis had, and to see us living those same experiences tells us something about the durability and persistence of these constructions of racism. It's extremely important that we understand that. As social scientists, or those of us who apply social science tools, we have to understand how to dismantle those structures. Theoretically, we have to understand what sustains them, what builds them, and we know that there are acts of terrorism and the use of excessive power that have contributed to sustaining those. Jim and I had a conversation after the display went up, and I think it was in Atlanta. But families used to take their children to witness hangings and lynchings as if it was public entertainment, like they were going to the theater, going over to Follinger Hall. But the purpose of that was to deliver a message. And we're watching a knee, a neck hole, a strangle hole, shooting a child. We're watching these events and reliving those experiences. Jim already called me out. Yes, I am as old. In fact, I may be a couple of months older than Jim, since my birthday comes in April and his in November. So I got him by 7 months. But we are both kids of the Emmett Till era. And I was living in the capital of the Confederacy. Jim was living in one of those towns that was competing to be the capital of the Confederacy, I think. But we have learned how to understand those conditions without having them defeat us. So the idea of understanding the conditions that are there and not seeing them as sporadic, as incidental, coincidental, they're not. Those are not coincidental things. Those are systemic, those are regular practices that people employ. The act of discrimination when it comes to preventing employment, and employers talk about it. We use a book in one of my classes called Stories Employers Tell. And it's all about the explanations they have for not hiring men of color, why we don't get the jobs. So we have to stop, to some extent, making excuses for it, but we have to understand how systematized it is. So living in Richmond, Virginia, that was segregation. We had all the signs and all the symbols. So I think it's important to understand, as David Williams helps us understand, the importance of understanding those as a health issue, our mental health in particular. Now, I just had a wonderful experience because we've got examples of the kind of scholarship that makes a difference that our graduates have done. I just wrote the foreword to a forthcoming book by Raquel Farmer, Ishwanzia Rivers, Lori Patton Davis, and Joy Lewis. And what they are attacking is this narrative. Part of the narrative says, well, Black folks can withstand excessive pain. That's why I got to keep my knee on his neck for another 30 seconds, another 40 seconds. Well, I got to stand on it. They have a collection of counter narratives that we have to use increasingly, our own stories. It's restorying the kinds of books that were written by, and Kozol didn't intend harm. He intended to do some good with pointing out the savagery of the kind of underfunding and poverty that is visited upon so many schools. Those of you who've worked in the area of doing DSEG and you walk through schools in urban areas and you've seen the broken windows, you've seen all the stuff that doesn't work. In the nation's capital, they have bathrooms in the schools that kids couldn't use, so kids and adults were going home at lunchtime. That's the nation's capital. So this is, again, it's not unusual. This is systematized, and it visits so many different parts of our lives. Well, again, we have examples of this kind of scholarship that we can do. And I was reading their work in order to write the foreword. What was striking to me was how strong that white community is in consistently delivering on this narrative that keeps them advantaged. Because in my era, it was those Black schools, those are schools for colored kids, Negro schools. Those schools don't have any quality. You don't want to go to that place. You can't get quality out of there. Well, I got a bunch of arrogant classmates from Maggie Walker High School. So we didn't, and fortunately, we're blessed because our teachers, like the teachers who taught those 4 Black women from East St. Louis who wrote that book, those teachers loved them, understood that they have talent, that they have skills, and they did their utmost work to develop them. We have to think of ways in which we can develop that kind of understanding on the part of the teachers who will teach our children. It's extremely important that we do that. We have to make it very hard for a teacher to see a kindergarten kid as eligible for handcuffs. We have to fight the notion that a Black female 2 years ago who had the highest GPA in her school could not be her school valedictorian. So she had to share that with a white classmate whose score wasn't the equal of it. But that's that narrative. And we do the research to refute that narrative. One end of our hall to the other. We do the research that challenges that narrative. We have to continue to do that research. And one other point that I'll make, and then I'll stop and go to your questions. We were at a conference on race in at Stanford. This has been probably almost a decade ago now. And Janelle Chichester, who's a lawyer for NAACP, she said she thinks we've been wrong in thinking that the attacks on efforts to diversify and desegregate the schools, she said, conceptualizing as an attack on Brown may be misconceived. Her argument is that it's an attack on citizenship. The intent that Black folks, people of color, indigenous folk, they're not entitled to citizenship. When you let a child die in the water holding on to the father, and they are here at the shores, what Trump said, I don't want any more of them as citizens. Same thing he was saying the other day when he said, those are not my voters marching. So I think we have to understand that the larger battle here is one of citizenship. It is fundamentally about citizenship. The citizenship that entitles you to the full support of the law. And we haven't gotten that. We've not gotten that kind of justice. Our rights of citizenship are constrained by redlining practices. Even if they're not written anymore, they are practiced still. When it comes to loans, when it comes to neighborhoods, those areas still show considerable amount of redlining. It's operationalized in the heads of these folks. So you have to understand that. And perhaps one other point. How do you decide that you can look at another human being and decide that you could do these inhumane things to them? How are you educated in a way that says that you are entitled to do these inhumane things to them? To shoot a woman 8 times in her bed after not announcing that you're entering her space that she owns. So we have to do the work to uncover the kind of socialization experiences that inculcate that master narrative in the minds of those folks who would do us that sort of harm. King said it, I can't legislate to make you love me, but I can legislate to prevent you from harming me. We have to work on doing the scholarship that produces the insights and the understandings that help us not harm ourselves by internalizing any of that poison as people of color, and preventing the expansion and continued embedding of those master narratives in our schools, in our literature, in our workplaces. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Trent. And it's a good thing we extended this town hall to an hour and a half, but because we have such wonderful panelists here, we also realize that we don't have as much time for question and answer. But it looks like from your likes of some of the questions that are being asked, let's go through at least some of the ones that are more liked or popular. I don't know I don't know the social media terms for this that has more likes to it, but I'm going to have the dean answer this question. Of course, I have from the student side, but there's a question with a considerable amount of support in terms of, are there plans to make anti-racism work part of the formal review process for students and faculty? Dean Anderson.
I need to unmute. What is meant by the formal review for students?
Right. Amir, did you want to, we can have you unmuted at least to, and what you mean by that. But while you get unmuted, I will say there's no reason why anti-racist work can't be supported in terms of what students and faculty research, especially in our college. But if you can also glean from that. Okay. As part of the annual reviews for students. That's Amir's question, part of that.
Well, about the only, I mean, we do annual reviews for graduate students. They're required by the graduate college, and I know that they actually put the registrations on hold if their advisors refuse to do this. But there are no cultural competence or anti-racist questions that are part of the review. Review has more to do with satisfactory progress toward degree. Aside from review of graduate students and review of faculty, I've said, and I'll say it again, I think that in all that we do, when we think about what we had to do for COVID-19 as we made the sudden shift online, right? Everybody had to get up to snuff, at least to a certain level of a basic competence of how to teach online. And this summer we are holding teaching academies to refine the quality of teaching online. And I think that in all we do in teaching, for instance, issues of anti-racism or cultural competence, those kinds of questions could be as much a part of a teaching academy as the use of Zoom or Moodle or things like that. Because we're trying to engage students, we're trying to deliver the highest quality of instruction. understanding the classes that we teach, the diverse body of students that we teach, being familiar with their concerns, their culture, language, and so forth. That should be a basic part of teaching competence. I've said again and again that particularly at the collegiate level, we get PhDs, and then we walk into a classroom without any training to teach. I noticed that, for instance, the College of Engineering has put together a teaching academy of sorts for its assistant professors, where they actually get a lot more training in how to teach. I think we could do this across the board. I think we could look at issues of cultural competence, cultural relevance, context, anti-racism, as we emphasize a better quality of teacher, a teacher that is much more familiar with the diverse backgrounds of their students, and teachers who are much more willing to engage the questions and concerns of their students.
Great. And I think there's also a corollary question that's related to faculty, and for a number of our students who are ready to enter the faculty stages. I will say that there are different levels with which units, and units meaning departments, promote and or are institutionalized or formalize diversity, equity, race efforts within that process. And we do that in our department, but yet as a dean and in terms of formally at the campus level, how would these things become institutionalized for promotion and tenure?
Well, as you know, on our campus, especially, and everywhere, people are very, very slow to change, which is our communication number 9. They're now looking at changes around issues of public engagement and how to give credit. And I think what we would look at from an institutional perspective is whether it's public engagement, whether it's anti-racism, which is part of public engagement, and the kind of work that we do to support communities that actually are the victims of systemic racism and institutional racism, is the kind of credit that faculty should get in their annual reviews when they do this kind of work. And if the institution is committed to that kind of public engagement, as it says it is committed, then we have to figure out some way that it's reflected in our promotion and tenure standards, as well as in the assessments we make for public engagement and the support that we provide for that kind of engagement.
Great, thank you. Let me address these couple of questions to Drs. Dixon and Gutierrez, whoever wants to chime in first, but it could be a reiteration, but really to emphasize. And what about, as Nathan asked, the critical scholarship the students want to do in particular, and how to, well, all right, you can kind of read that too, right? The value and validity, well, I mean, I don't know if we necessarily have to, well, you have a better way of explaining this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think value and validity are going to vary based on how you're positioned, right? So, and the paradigm wars have been settled a long time ago. I was actually having this conversation with students this morning about what counts as knowledge and what different reviewers and funding agencies and whatnot believe to be true. What's encouraging, and Rodney spoke about this earlier in terms of the numbers of funders, there are some who are kind of new to the game in terms of these kind of trying to respond to what's happening right now. But I'll say what's encouraging is that WT Grant is actually interested in critical perspectives on so they have an inequality phase, but they're also interested in uses of research. So how has research been used to move or compel education policy? And they want to hear from perspectives that have been ignored. So they are interested in critical race perspectives. They are interested in critical feminist perspectives and methodologies, because they recognize that in just kind of traditional psychometric or econometric research, they're missing. You're only seeing a certain slice of it. So I think, and I think Rochelle said something about the revolution won't be published, or won't be funded. It is increasingly challenging to do that. There are some folk who are willing. Some of the research, this is really on institutions. So I was encouraged to hear Doc say that Illinois is thinking about ways of supporting work that works with communities that are underserved, that are often oppressed by race. That's encouraging, because in the absence of external funders, you absolutely need your support from your institution, and that support may look different. So, can we find some way to provide support for graduate students to work on a research team with a faculty member? Can we be creative about release time so that we can, go and do the research? Can we reconfigure teaching teams so that we're teaching collaboratively to free up time? Like there are ways that, institutions can think about this that support faculty and students who are really interested in working in community and helping to document and raise awareness and to understand how phenomena are manifesting in particular communities. And so it's the institutional support in the absence of, external funders, but that's what I'm thinking right now.
Great. Can I just add to that really quickly? Thank you, Dr. Dixon. I agree, and yes, I think we need to always be remembering that, especially for those of us that are people of color and people who have dissenting views about the status quo, our work will always be dismissed. So part of that political clarity is not looking for the approval of other people. It's not looking for other people to fund our work. Or, when they do fund our work, we have to consider ourselves grifters. How do we take that work? How do we take that money and shift it into things that we know are important to do? But if we are only defining ourselves as professionals or as part of the academy as trying to measure up to what other people want, and I know that's not necessarily what you're saying, Nathan, but I think it's that political clarity of saying, we're going to continue to do this work even though it's going to continue to be dismissed, even though it's going to be seen, even though we're going to be seen as, when we study our own people, because it's who we hold ourselves accountable to, that we are seen as being now subjective, that we can't be objective because we are studying the very communities in which we have a stake in, when nobody else questions that. But I also think it's important to remember that that in doing this work, we have to consider, who are we citing? And that's part of the politics. So knowing that who we are citing is who we belong to, and we know where we've come from, so that we can know where we're going. And so, so I think that's the only part that I wanted to add to what Dr. Dixon said.
Great, thank you. I know we're out of time, but I think, yes, but I think it's important to address, there's another question. I'm sorry, Dr. Hobson will come back, but I just want to be sure that we'll go a little over time, but for that, I'd like Dr. Spann to address it. So Dr. Hobson, please go.
I was more asking for some of us who are not reading all of the prompts. Could you, as moderator, just help us with whatever general question is being asked? I'm not following the chat, so just to round out the question, so we know. Yeah, thanks so much.
Right, great, thank you. So Dr. Spann, I think it's important to finish off, if we can collapse some of the more important points of what Katrina has asked, in terms of how do we make sure that at this moment we have it centered on African-American issues and challenges, especially that needs to be understood. At the same time, what can be, well, issue of racism in the classroom. So those are the two main points that you can help us understand.
You give me the toughest question in the room. It's an excellent question. And I do think that all the speakers have spoke to this in very meaningful ways. It starts with education, starts with intentionality. It starts with understanding that we will stumble through this. It's going to be awkward. As our dean said, most of us have never ever been required to take the time or ever been in systems that took the time to teach us what a term like racism means, and then understand it from an individual and institutional, systemic, structural way, and walk us through those examples and help us understand how we can dismantle those examples. So I think when it's all said and done, the challenge is before us. Like the brutality we saw that happened to someone like George Floyd, or Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless others. I mean, what we're witnessing are just examples of a larger system that structurally has determined that Black lives don't matter, at least not equally in America. And I think we have to get at the undergird of that. A piece that I just wrote, George Floyd was killed over apparently a dispute over the legitimacy of a $20 bill. And Mr. Brooks in Atlanta was killed because he was a little inebriated and driving while intoxicated, and maybe fell asleep in his car. He did give him his car keys. He said he would walk home, and then it just escalated to a point that it should never gotten to. And so when you think about those kind of considerations and examples, we have normalized the fact that these folks just lost their lives over the most senseless of maddening reasons, and they just simply shouldn't have. So we have to now get to a point that should just be moral outrage, not just the police brutality, but those are the individual acts. The institutional acts there are whole cities like Flint that don't have water to drink, and we're kind of cool with that. We're not cool with it, but we're not doing anything about it. That's a systemic form of racism. There are whole cities that are malnourished and undereducated and over-policed, and we haven't done anything about that. So once we get beyond these and there's a whole system that basically says we should be comfortable with this. And if we speak out, take a knee, for example, you could lose your livelihood. And it supports the people who want you to lose your livelihood rather than supporting the people who are trying to make change in a just way. So I think that's the part that's plaguing humanity. So we have to remove two viral pandemics right now. One that is contagion to our respiratory system, and the other is a contagion to our hearts and minds, fear and racism. And so how we think about that, how we go about that, I mean, those are our challenges in the days ahead, but I just don't want us to stop short. It's going to be tiring work, and there are going to be some extremely dark days. And as our dean alluded, we should probably anticipate some disturbing outcomes, that people may not be arrested or charged, or just due may not come to those who had caused harm to the people who have fallen. But we have to be persistent to remind ourselves that even amid these pains, Mr. Brooks was shot amid people protesting because someone was killed by the police. I mean, that's just about as point blank as it gets. So there will be casualties and there will be challenges as you protest, and there will be setbacks. But I would encourage you not to get discouraged and to keep that dream alive. I do say this, I don't know if they envisioned it or not when they were sitting in Montgomery, Alabama, saying we're going to boycott a bus company who refuses to comply with the law of the land. And here's a woman, Rosa Parks, who, again, Emmett Till, and she was like, I just honestly, part of her narrative is I couldn't get up because all I can remember is what happened to that young boy in Mississippi. And I don't know if they imagined that 13 years later that they would reconstruct in America and dismantle a system of segregation by law. And so their efforts started out just to have some semblance of justice and equal opportunity in a city that was denying them that. And I think we shouldn't set out for these grand goals. What we should is concentrate on what's in front of us now. And in the process, some of those grand challenges will be meted out by the collective action and will of people across the nation. So I think we should concentrate on what's in front of us and keep moving forward from there. So
Great, thank you. Actually, and that is the other question. Thank you, Rakaya, for chiming in. I want Dr. Anderson to provide the final comments, but also a number of students and other of our colleagues. The question is, how how do we help students overcome resistance to learning about racism and systemic oppression while they're sitting in these mandated classes designed to help them learn about racism and systemic oppression?
Is that for me, you said?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've been teaching a course on race and cultural diversity for a long time, ever since the Latinx student strike in 1992. And from the outset, my approach was this, to say, look, this is not a set aside. This is not something strange. This is not something that's being brought to you by a Martian. This is ordinary part of our history and of our society. And so you teach it that way. You don't teach it as though, oh, this is going to be something different for you. It's like, this is mainstream, really. And, I often start off with the quote from the poem by Maya Angelou, when she said that history, despite its wrenching pain, can never be unlived, but if faced with courage, need never be lived again. And so that's my challenge. Do you want to live it again? Or do you want to face our history squarely and think about how we change the course, how we go to a different track? And to do so, this is basic American history, basic American sociology. A study of institutional racism is just classic American sociology. You're looking at discrimination in labor markets, in employment, in housing, in education. What could be more central than that? Now, some people start with the view that Ben Carson has, that, we don't have systemic racism anymore. It doesn't exist. And it was interesting because he said he saw a lot of racism when he was a child, but now it's gone away. You're not that old. You're not 200 years old. But the basic approach we have to be for everyone in this country, for every classroom, for every community, said we're talking about that, which is so ordinary and so fundamental, is not something that we need to treat as if it's different or set aside or some alien experience. It's just having the courage to face it squarely, because that's the only way we can ever get beyond it.
Thank you so very much. We are more than out of time, but I think it really speaks to the level of engagement that everyone attending and those who had to leave early to want to participate. And I think it would be important to continue to have these conversations in so many different ways. It's so important to point out that we do have college level resources. Of course, it's always a beginning, right? But here are some additional resources that's been provided by our past deans Distinguished Lecture Series, our Office of Community College Research and Leadership, which does so much, is an incredible resource for K through 12, higher ed, those in the workforce. Please check out those resources. There's also, for those of you who are teaching in this moment in K-12, in our school systems, and in this COVID moment, how we proceed in this way. But again, you have heard from the dean and our expert faculty. There are ways that you need to take the initiative and do the work that is important to do. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but so what? It's a lot worse for so many folks living this moment right now. So, and yes, and to mention too that later tonight, we've got Dr. Span, who will be providing a Facebook Live talk based on the article that was published on the News Gazette, and also that was publicized through the College of Education newsletter. So please make sure to catch all those moments, and we just have to do it. That's what it is. All right, so without any further ado, if anyone else has final things that they want to add, I really want to thank you all, and we'll just keep talking and we'll do what we need to do. All right. Thank you, everyone.